For those of you who are joining us, it is good morning, good afternoon, good evening, 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and 5 o'clock British Summer Time. I'm Greg Lindsay. I am the Director of Applied Research here at the New Cities Foundation in Montreal, and it is my pleasure to invite you all to the premiere episode of the Big Rethink, which is a limited edition series that New Cities is running for the next 8 weeks, at this time on Tuesdays, to explore the implications of the coronavirus COVID-19 global pandemic and its effects on cities, and how cities around the world are struggling to adapt to what is quickly becoming the worst pandemic in several generations, at least back to the 1957 flu epidemic. And so we hope that you'll join us for all of this, because for the next 8 weeks, we're going to be discussing this crisis through a different lens and aspect of the city, from mobility to housing to well-being, to climate and energy and beyond. And so, as I mentioned a few moments ago, for those of you who are joining us, we're very excited to have over 2,500 participants are currently on the call. This is going to be one of the largest events that New Cities has ever hosted. So in addition to people who are joining us from Los Angeles, Chicago, Montreal, and London, we're basically going to have people here from dozens of cities globally as well. So thank you all so much for making the time to join us wherever you are. And speaking of that, we wish we could see you, but for the sake of simplicity and to keep the flow of conversation moving, we're going to basically limit our video today to just the participants. And I would encourage all of you to submit questions right now, because for the second half of this, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Michael Woodbridge, who will basically manage the second half, selecting some of your questions. And for those of you whose questions aren't answered, I would encourage you to tweet at us using the hashtag you can see on your screens, NewCitiesLive, and we will do our best to field questions before and after the debate. So today, as I mentioned, our focus is on public space. We are in the sort of odd condition right now where, we're basically, the public realm that cities, of course, manage, that makes a city, is off limits to us. I keep thinking of the phrase, that half of the world's population, effectively, has been asked to shelter in place, a term that came into being to basically describe what you should do when you are being stalked in a place by someone with the intent of killing you. And this time around, that killer is a virus. And we're being asked to shelter in a place, cutting us off from the cities that we know and love. And it's my pleasure today to have this distinguished group of panelists who are joining us from around the country and around the world to discuss some of the implications of this. How do we rethink the role of public space in the public realm when simply being in it is potentially fatal to us, our loved ones, and our communities? How do we both turn that to our advantage? How do we rethink what public space can and should be? And how do we avoid some of the worst implications of this, of falling into a mindset of bunker and fortress? This session was inspired by a series of tweets that Christopher Hawthorne, who is the Chief Design Officer of the City of LA, first posed on Twitter, and we're going to come to him in a moment. But first, we'd like to dedicate today's session to Michael Sorkin, the architect and critic and fierce advocate of public space, who tragically is one of the more than 10,000 victims of coronavirus to date. And so Chris is asked to read a very short selection to begin with, from Michael Sorkin's 250 Things Every Architect Should Know. So Chris, please.
Thank you, Greg, and hello, everybody. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be on with you and with Richard and Jeannie, two people whose work I really greatly admire. And I apologize in advance for any sluggishness in my connection. I have two kids taking Zoom classes this morning, as well as my wife who's working from home. But we'll do our best, and I really thought it was appropriate that we dedicate this to Michael, who really helped us think about the future of cities, how to make them more just, in particular, in really brave ways. So this is just the opening of his essay, of his essay, 250 Things an Architect Should Know. That's not my phone, I promise you, which you can find in Verso, collection of his from 2018. 250 Things an Architect Should Know. The feel of cool marble under bare feet, how to live in a small room with 5 strangers for 6 months, with the same strangers in a lifeboat for 1 week, the modulus of rupture, the distance a shout carries in the city, the distance of a whisper, everything possible about Hatshepsut's temple, try not to see it as modernist avant la lettre. The number of people with rent subsidies in New York City in your town include the rich. The flowering season for azaleas, the insulating properties of glass, the history of its production and use and of its meaning, how to lay bricks, what Victor Hugo really meant by this will kill that, the rate at which the seas are rising, building information modeling, how to unclog a rapidograph, the Gini coefficient, a comfortable tread to riser ratio for a 6-year-old in a wheelchair, the energy embodied in aluminum, how to turn a corner, how to design a corner, how to sit in a corner, how Antoni Gaudí modeled the Sagrada Familia and calculated its structure, the proportioning system for the Villa Rotunda, the rate at which that carpet you specified off-gasses, the relevant sections of the Code of Hammurabi, the migratory patterns of warblers and other seasonal travelers, the basics of mud construction, the direction of prevailing winds, hydrology is destiny, Jane Jacobs in and out, something about feng shui, something about Vastu Shilpa, elementary ergonomics, the color wheel, what the client wants, what the client thinks it wants, what the client needs, what the client can afford, what the planet can afford. And I'll leave it there. That's the first 43 of 250 things an architect should know.
Thank you, Chris. Well, that alone will open up any number of questions for us to explore in the session. But first, I want to frame it, given that the focus of the Big Rethink is particularly on the here and now, on what cities are doing at this moment, and as it deals with the sort of fog of war from how coronavirus is affecting them. As I mentioned, you tweeted a sort of series of questions, asking your peers, fellow practitioners, how can cities respond to this? And what are cities doing to reimagine their public space when we see children's playgrounds covered in police tape and other sort of aspects of the public realm walled off? You tweeted that several weeks ago. I'd be curious your initial impressions on what you've learned, what you're talking about with others, and what can you put into place and how quickly?
I think to a certain extent, those tweets have been overtaken by the work that we've been doing in the mayor's office, and that is to say we've been really focusing on the present of cities rather than the future of them, and certainly there'll be time for that kind of speculation, and this is one of the conversations that will, I think, help frame some of those questions. For me personally, it's meant working on increasing capacity, so working on helping pair architects with colleagues of mine who are working to increase temporary hospital space in places like our convention center, for example, to get ready for a surge of COVID-19 patients, as well as most recently the last week to 10 days, working on the 3D printing of PPE, particularly face shields and a version of N95 masks that we can deliver to hospitals, and really tapping the 3D printing capacity expertise of architects, design schools, architecture schools around the city. Those have really turned out to be the focus of the work that we've been doing in the immediate sense. In the slightly longer term, the sort of medium term, we're certainly watching very carefully what other cities are doing in terms of trying to rebalance public space, given the increase in the number of pedestrians and cyclists in a lot of neighborhoods and a lot of cities around the world, and the really dramatic decrease in Los Angeles' case in automobile traffic. And so we've watched those experiments play out with various degrees of success in cities like New York and Denver, Minneapolis, and elsewhere. And so we're certainly having a lot of conversations about how we might rebalance that public space. And the last thing I'll say is, I think as I've been thinking about it more, this is not, I think some of the conversations about what this crisis means for public space, and particularly for density and dense cities, have been, if not misguided, not particularly to the point. And I think this is really a disease that feeds, we're learning, on close quarters, on crowdedness as opposed to density per se, and really on interior spaces. We've yet to see, although of course we have yet to see real evidence of hotspots that emerge from crowded sidewalks or parks, for example. We've seen many more reports of hotspots, the virus feeding on birthday parties and nursing homes and cruise ship buffets, et cetera, these kinds of close quarters, largely in interior spaces. And the measures that we have in place, which absolutely are crucial, don't get me wrong, to close or restrict movement in public spaces, have more to do, excuse me, with keeping people from traveling from one crowded interior to another, right? Rather than the particular danger of open space and public space. And that's one reason I was interested to read a couple days ago that Singapore describes its efforts to close public space as a circuit breaker rather than a lockdown. And it's a sort of rolling and adaptable series of closures that can respond and, again, break the circuit or the connection between one interior space and all the others in the city, which is really where the danger, more than anything, I would say, lies.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Moving on, Jeannie. Of course, for those of you who don't know, Jeannie is the founding principal of Studio Gang, which is a global practice. And Jeannie, we invited you today, of course, because as a practicing architect, you're actively dealing with spaces, social spaces in the public realm of any number of size. I mean, you're working with universities, you worked on parks, you're working in the heart of cities, you're in fact working on an international airport terminal at a time where there is no international aviation. So I'm curious, as an opening question, about your conversations with the clients. I think to Sorkin's thing about what the client thinks they want and what they need and what the planet needs. What are those conversations like right now? Are we in a mode of rethinking everything? What are sort of the early trends or thoughts about how public space might change, and how can it change? How is this an opportunity, and what are also the dangers of potential lockdown, which we'll come to Richard in a second as well.
Well, thanks, Greg, and thanks for having me. This is a great opportunity to connect with other people when they're so far remote. I think as far as our projects are going and clients are going, most of the time planning is done for the long term and thinking farther out ahead than the duration of this particular pandemic. And so the ideas that are out there are still valid for public space, for parks. I think even more than ever, thinking of green space and parks as part of the infrastructure of a city is really key. And we know that, that those, as Chris mentioned, it's not exactly like there's hotspots in outdoor spaces. We have to use them carefully, but they are crucial to our health and mental health and physical health, especially in times like these. So, and that gets me to, this idea of how is an interior space to be healthy? And one of the key things in architecture to reduce energy use and carbon emissions is to use natural ventilation. And if you look back in time at the ways that buildings dealt with diseases, it was always to create, like in the old sanatoriums where people would go to recover from TB, or in other outbreaks, the idea of having natural ventilation and open window is a key piece of that. And we've gone away from that overall and rely too much on mechanical systems to exchange air when you can actually get a lot more exchanges of air with an open window and fresh air. So that will increasingly, I think, hopefully be embraced. There's always reasons not to do it in architecture, cost of an operable window versus the fixed and all these different things. But at the end of the day, we need to move in that direction. And I think another thing that we see in our city, in our urban practice, is and what we see a problem from this pandemic is it's the opposite of what they did in the 20s. When we see the spreading out of a city, the expansion of a city with great distances in between, you would think, oh, well, that's great because people have more distance between one another. In fact, the support mechanisms that we need in crises like these, not only this one, but in climate-related disasters, relies on people actually coming together and knowing each other, especially with, when there isn't a very strong leadership from the top, let's say, we need to have more communication with each other and more informal social networks set up to help each other. So as opposed to thinking of the city to be more healthy, spread out, we really need to think about how to get the crucial, essential services to be more self-sufficient in the smaller areas, smaller neighborhoods. And you see movements like this right now in places like Portland, of course, the 20-minute neighborhood, or in Paris, the 15-minute city, the idea that all the essential services can be within walking distance or biking distance. And that would, I think, be a good direction for us to go with urban planning today, because that way those critical things can be at arm's reach in emergency situations. I think one more thing that just maybe comes to mind for architecture is office space. Like what will happen to the future of work? Will people, now that everyone knows that they can do Zoom meetings all the time, will companies say, we don't want to build any more office space because we can offload those costs to the individuals and they can just work from home? And I would say that, there's a danger of thinking like that, because there is a lot. I don't know about you guys, but I'm ready to go running back to the office as soon as possible. But because we get other things from this social connectivity at the workplace, and the more that the workspace is designed to allow people to, kind of feel part of it, like at Studio Gang, for example, we have our own rooftop garden that people partake in. It changes form. There are bees there. It's rewilded, and so anyway, it's a thing that belongs to all of us, and we share it, and it's just another thing that makes us want to be at the office with others collaborating. So I think there will still be, for creativity and for this really important social connections, there'll be a need for workspaces. Maybe those workspaces will evolve more to be more enriching and more participatory, for example.
Well, thank you, Jeannie. I would say those are excellent points. We have an entire session devoted to the future of work in cities coming in a couple of weeks, so we will be revisiting that point. But also great points on density, as you and Chris mentioned, because some others, we received a comment before the series saying that we should be focusing on sort of the immediate emergencies, the health implications and elsewhere. But it's important to have this conversation as well, because we're seeing this reaction starting to form in real time that this should be the end of cities, that we should be rethinking density completely and abandoning it, which is also the theme of a later episode. And so, yeah, reiterating the importance of the 15-minute city and these kinds of connections and the importance of public space, I think it's important that we have that, which is, of course, a perfect segue to Richard, given that this is, in fact, his life's work. And Richard was kind enough to contribute for NewCities an essay to our Big Picture series on the state of exception, where Richard raised several questions, which I'd like you to sort of reframe here, about the dangers of this present moment, about what norms will be locked in place that will preserve social distancing or make it pernicious, perhaps, in fact. Richard, in your essay, you pointed to 9/11 as one of the great examples of how snap decisions were made that have affected the public realm for 2 decades. And I thought it might be interesting if we could start from there as a starting point to reflect on what should we learn from the days after 9/11 so we don't make the same mistakes again.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm glad that this program is dedicated to Michael Sorkin, who was a wonderful friend to me, and I think was a wonderful friend to cities as well. My worry is simply that states of exception are opportunities for power to normalize necessary conditions which should be temporary. For instance, in Britain, where I'm speaking from, there's been a lot of, we are in total lockdown, and there's been a lot of talk about giving the state the power to regulate which businesses should be allowed to open and the terms under which they should function, even after the curve of infection ends. And that's a mild version of what's happening in places like Hungary, where the expansion of state power has seized on this virus, as on this pandemic, as a way of justifying new controls over the individual. So my worry about this is that we understand that the kind of extreme things we're doing now are temporary, and that they don't get lodged in the law the way in 9/11, many of the building codes after 9/11 assumed, gave the planning powers a kind of control over the building of housing as well as office buildings in New York City, that it took about a decade to dislodge. Power is exploitative of crises, and that's my worry. I want to say that on a slightly different note, that I agree with both Chris and with Jeannie that we shouldn't confuse physical distancing with social distancing, and that we'll find lots of ways to manage healthy physical distancing in such a way that people's sociability isn't damaged. But I think that's going to be more possible in developed cities and in privileged societies than it's going to be in places in the world which are not so privileged. I'm working now with the UN about how cities in the so-called developing world, in the third world, can deal with climate change. And many of the proposals we've had for making, dealing with climate change in the third world conflict with the kind of logic of healthy cities. I'll give you an example for this. We have been stressing the need to create really dense forms of public transit, get people in buses, in trams. Obviously can't, few places can afford subways, but to mass people together to go to work as a way of cutting pollution in cities like Delhi or Johannesburg. And that's something that's good for the green city, but it creates a health hazard with pandemics. The same thing is true about ideas like the 15 or 20-minute city, the walkable city. In most places in cities in the third world, where people work is far, far away from the slums or favelas in which they live. They have to journey a long, long time to get to the work at all. The notion that they would cycle, say, 3 hours a day in Mexico City to go do a job and then cycle home is something that is, it's just not on. That's a privileged view of pedestrian life. So to deal with that, we've got to understand much more what the economics of decentralizing a city would be for people at the bottom. In order to have something like what Paris has proposed, these 15-minute walkable cities, would entail an economic transformation which is enormous in a place like Mexico City, where there is no investment in work in most of the barrios surrounding Mexico City. The people are living in appropriated land. There has been a great deal of neglect of all the public services they need. They're forced out of the local by the effects of neoliberal capitalism. And to deal with those kinds of urban problems, we really need to think about how we can reorganize the economy of cities. It's the same sort of thing, even in our, I would say, even in our more privileged places like America or Britain, with the idea of working from home. We're in the midst of a huge, in my view, a huge natural experiment in inequality, because we're going to find that most of the jobs that allow people to work from home are middle-class jobs, but that the service jobs, which require face-to-face contact, everything from health services to checkouts to people who do repair work, all of that is face-to-face. And one of my fears about what is going to happen is that the kind of experiment we are undergoing in how much work can actually be protected in terms of health from crowding is really an experiment in how inequality will take a new and even more exaggerated form between the working class and the middle class. So I guess what I'm saying is my worry about this is first that power is going to normalize the exceptional measures we have now. And that a lot of the proposals that we have for reconciling green cities and healthy cities suppose a kind of privilege that for most of the people who live in cities around the world is not possible for them. And finally, that amongst ourselves in our own cities, that I'm afraid that one of the results of what's happening now is going to be to widen inequality in societies. Now, what do we do about that? I hope I have an answer before
well, that will set up the
very
next
old, but you know, I hope to find some kind of answers.
Well, that will set up the next question.
Shuffle off this mortal coil.
Yeah. Hopefully not soon, Richard. But I'll bring that up for Chris and Jeannie in just a second there on some of the responses, because you bring up several excellent points. One, next week's episode is devoted to mobility and public transit, exactly the questions you're raising there. We'll return to the megacity question in a couple of weeks, as I mentioned. But yes, we are, as you framed it there, you know, there's a great website, there's a great essay on the website, Failed Architecture, that brings up some of the issues you raise about this level of inequality. And in fact, what the crisis shows is just how unequal the previous situation was, and what we're not trying to get back to is a state of bliss, but really the status quo that was before, which frames my question here for Chris and Jeannie, which is everything is up for grabs right now, right? We are in a state of exception. People are trying to advance various ideas and agendas. And Chris, I mean, now that you're an architecture critic who's now within the city and working out of the mayor's office, and Jeannie, obviously you worked very closely with the mayor of Chicago's office and cities elsewhere. You know, what are the opportunities? What are the levers here to make these kinds of changes? If we're going to take street space from cars and turn that into a de facto public space, how do we advance that agenda now? Or how do we advance the agenda to make, you know, use this as a state of exception to advance a more human-centered urban agenda? Obviously, that time for conversations is about to come once we move out of the immediate crisis. And how do we begin those in the corridors of power? Chris, please.
Sure. So I think it's always a question of the challenges of balancing these immediate questions and keeping in mind the fact that we are still seeing rising death tolls in cities in this country. We have not hit a peak in Los Angeles in terms of serious cases. You know, as Richard rightly mentions, to imagine what this crisis will mean for a country like India, for example, you know, only remains to be seen. But I think it is precisely the role of cities to also figure out a way to talk about the meanings of this crisis and what it would, what the opportunities are to think about living in a more just and equitable way. Again, which is one of the reasons we wanted to dedicate this conversation to Michael Sorkin, who always kept those questions at the forefront. So for us, it's just about if we are going to move into that middle term and longer term set of questions, doing it in a thoughtful way that, first of all, is not exploitative of the crisis or doesn't lose sight of the immediate need to marshal all the forces we can to help keep our curve as flat as possible, but also do it in a really thoughtful way so that things don't backfire and we don't lose ground I think the example from New York of these very limited pilots for pedestrianized streets, have been shut down after just a few days. And we are looking, as I mentioned, at other cities and beginning to think about what a longer lasting version of that might look like. And it begins, I think, with having, in a certain way, it goes against some of our impulses. We have had a hugely successful open streets festival called Ciclovia in Los Angeles for 10 years now, modeled on Ciclovia from Bogota. Each of those, which happens on a Sunday, closes down several miles of streets for biking and walking, has been a kind of destination and a kind of street festival. It has had cultural, it has readings and other things. It's not just about mobility or public space. It's about understanding, looking at architecture in a different way, moving through the city at a different pace, et cetera. But that cannot be a model for these new pedestrianized streets that respond to COVID-19 because they need to be the exact opposite. We can't do anything that will begin to attract crowds. We still have a lot of understandable caution and even skepticism from public health professionals about any change along these lines. And so we would have to do the opposite of a Ciclovia. We'd have to do a large-scale change. We'd have to under-publicize it in a certain way so these don't become destinations, right? We have to under-design them in a certain way. There's no need, there's no time or need to have a kind of put on any kind of design airs, right? So what we want in an ideal version of this would be just capacity expanding in a way that people recognize in their own neighborhood, right? It just immediately appears, they can take advantage of it. Nobody's driving to get to those destinations. It's just a way that we can rebalance streets. And a couple of people have made a very good point about how pedestrians now, given the kind of dictates or protocols of social distancing, sort of move through cities in the same way that cars do. If you imagine a 6 foot, a 6 foot sort of safety zone in every direction from a pedestrian, that the space that one pedestrian needs to take up for safety reasons is a lot closer to a car than a typical pedestrian or cyclist, right? So there might be a need to think about what that means for streets and how we divide that space. So these are ongoing conversations. We want to be very we want to move as urgently as we need to, but also be very thoughtful so that these don't become projects that create a kind of backsliding or cut into the progress we've made. Two more really quick points. One is that in terms of work, I think telecommuting, I think Richard is right to raise these questions about the privilege of telecommuting. But in a city like Los Angeles, to the degree, as Jeannie pointed out, that we have people who've learned how to do it, if your job allows it, and you could telecommute 1 day a week, and every employee in every office that can do that is staying at home 1 day a week, what that would mean for traffic, mobility, air quality in a city like Los Angeles could be remarkable and transformative, and that we need to be thinking along those lines. And I'll leave it there. I know we're getting to questions soon.
Thank you, Chris. Jeannie, quickly before we go to Q&A, you've designed actually existing public infrastructure for Chicago, the boathouses, for example, on the river, and also proposed more radical proposals like the Polis station in the Chicago Biennial. Where do you see the most, either most imminent or most interesting opportunities here to rethink what public space can be and public infrastructure?
Yes, I think we have to start, the biggest picture issue that we have to address right now is inequity and climate change, which were both mentioned already. And so we see something like the pandemic is like, it's a good chance to layer in those resiliencies that we already need in our cities, as pointed out by Richard, with developing cities, but even in a city like New York, which looks diverse, but if you zoom into it block by block, it really isn't that diverse. So that means that people who are in these service industries in a city like New York still have to take public transport to get to their jobs. So we have to zoom into it and to address the ability to have people, more mixed groups in smaller clusters of neighborhoods, and making them more, at the same time, more resilient to climate change and reducing pollution. Just today, we see that in the New York Times that the people more vulnerable to COVID are also in places where there are more particulate matter in the air, so more pollution is also exacerbating this disease. And we can think about designing our streets and our institutions to try to address that by making streets more healthy, complete streets, like where trees are actually allowed to touch roots underneath the ground and be healthier in absorbing carbon, and any other resiliency measures that are already in the works for climate change can be overlaid with the addressing these issues of the pandemic. But I was also going to say that I think the issue that what makes us resilient is maybe the word flexibility comes to mind for me, because with flexible institutions and public spaces, they can be made to accommodate things in times of crisis. And like, I think what will happen and what we should take advantage of is planning for these crises. But even like, imagine if this pandemic's happening and then there was like a Hurricane Sandy on top of that. I mean, these are the things that we're going to start to see happening. And so there really needs to be a plan for cities to, like, maybe there's a contract between cities and hoteliers that will be able to lease rooms for emergency situations, or think about designing for people in even in institutions like in jails. They're very unhealthy places. How can they have fresh air? How can they be made to be more flexible? How can we use libraries for different uses during these things? So I think that's the big work. We have to think of it all together: the climate change, the inequity, and then the issue of health in cities, and to make the cities more resilient. So those are the types of planning exercises and workshops. As we did with the police station, now how could a police station actually be more of a community center on a daily basis, and thereby building this trust, this basic cohesion, social cohesion that is needed to respond to crises like this.
Thank you, Jeannie. Well, I'm going to take this time to defer to the audience, but I would say the last thing to add to this great conversation is, which I hope will come up in audience questions as well, is also this also poses a potential reckoning for, again, thinking about racial inequality and spatial inequality in American cities. Because once again, the numbers that we're seeing coming out of Chicago and Milwaukee and Washington, D.C. is that the victims of the pandemic are overwhelmingly African American in proportion to their percentage of the population. So again, thinking of this trifecta as well. But at this moment, because we've gone over a little bit of our time, I'd like to turn over to my colleague Michael Woodbridge, who has been operating, the man behind the curtain, who may make himself seen, but he's been diligently monitoring the questions and answers the questions coming in from the audience, and will now start posing some of those to our panelists. So, Michael, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for all of your amazing questions. There are very, very many of them, and I'm not going to be able to get through all of them, but I'm going to start with a question from Katrina from Philadelphia, who's wondering about the implications on semi-public, semi-private space in the form of balconies and front porches at this time for the purposes of social infrastructure, and whether this will be something that's made more standard in architecture as we move forward. And I've selected questions that I think all of our participants and panelists can weigh in on.
I can jump in on balconies. I mean, we've seen, again, this access to fresh air becoming so important, and how to be part. It's a great question, because it's, like the outdoor balcony is a perfect place to kind of be part of a community, but not have the physical proximity that is dangerous. And you've seen that in places like Italy, where the balconies are used for playing music, or in cities like Amsterdam, or even in New York, where balconies are now, even a fire escape can be used to step outside and to encourage those health care workers as they come home in the evenings, and all the essential workers. So I think it really will be, it is a great technique to encourage outdoor fresh air, and being part of a building community in the city at the same time. So I think we will see I would hope that we see more and more innovation around that threshold space.
And just quickly to jump in, that the Los Angeles version of that threshold space maybe is the space between units at the ground level. So we've had a huge explosion in the construction of ADUs, granny flat second units in Los Angeles, and now state law allows us to build a third unit, a so-called junior ADU. Meanwhile, we've been thinking a lot about the fourplex as a particularly good scale for a lot of Los Angeles neighborhoods that have traditionally been single family. Single-family neighborhoods do not have a lot of resilience built in. They tend to promote a kind of isolation, particularly as those neighborhoods age in place. And so that threshold space within a fourplex, for example, or a triplex, a relationship between a main house, as it were, and secondary units, particularly in landscape, is a way to build that resiliency. And we really have seen in Los Angeles, even before this crisis, that building in that kind of resiliency in public or quasi-public or shared or communal spaces, of which Los Angeles has not been known as a kind of city of detached, at least known as a city of detached single family houses, building that in is a way to prepare for the kind of resilience we'll need as climate change accelerates, et cetera.
Ginny, let me ask you, do you think that that what's really implicit in giving people fresh air and giving them balconies, which is wonderful, requires that we start thinking about how to make lower cities? Because it strikes me that a balcony on a 21st floor isn't going to do what you want. And that maybe there's some correlation between opening up, particularly residential buildings, and building lower, that the age of the tower apartment block is maybe over.
I think that's a kind of a question of, again, it's maybe a city that is wealthy and can make a decision not to go up, where we have many cities where going vertical is the only option. And I'm not saying how vertical, but I don't know how low you're talking about either. But I do think we can study ways to make balconies comfortable at different heights of buildings by studying the wind, by studying how, the tall building I don't think is going away. And it should be possible to utilize outdoor connection, even if it's only, for a small part of the year, to be able to get fresh air. But I agree with you, like in a low city, there's more connection to the ground. And that is more about, the public nature of space. But up in a tower, maybe it's more about connecting to a neighbor a few floors down, just seeing other people and being socially, getting to know each other on the facade of the building, for example.
Well, in a city like Mumbai, which is now a city of middle-class towers, the attractiveness of it is getting away from people on the ground. That is, that going up tall is a way of removing yourself from engagement with the street. And I'm just wondering, I don't know, I'm not an architect, but I'm just wondering if, in a certain sense, a lot of discussions we have about healthy forms of housing imply kind of new models in which density isn't as vertical, that it's more spread out.
I think that's definitely worse.
The kind of perimeter housing in Vienna is more the model than the kind of middle-class towers of Beijing, the same thing, which is the tower in Beijing is a way of getting away from the street, getting away from poor people who are down below.
I don't know if it's always true, because there are lots of cases of tall buildings that are not for exclusive reasons. It's to be close to the center, to be close to work, or so I think actually we need to study all modes of connecting to the outdoors in all forms of urbanization.
I want to cut this part short so we can move on to the next question, but I would just like to note that it's interesting that people are revisiting the connections or potentially between the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic and its influence on the Bauhaus and Le Corbusier's notions of light and air and space. And it will be interesting to see the repercussions from this as that ripples outwards and what that means for exactly these kinds of questions. But Michael, I'm sure we have more questions from the audience.
We do have many more questions from the audience. This question comes from Sarah, and she asks, how do we anticipate gathering spaces to change in response to the pandemic, as in the public perception of personal safety from a health perspective?
Chris, perhaps.
Sure. I mean, I think we've certainly been starting to work through some of the ways in which the 1918 flu affected these questions in Los Angeles. And I have a good friend named Bill Deverell, a historian at USC, who has been forwarding me photographs from 1918 of people wearing masks, standing about 6 feet apart, really to their black and white versions of the photographs that we're seeing in cities right now. On the other hand, there have been other flus, like there was a so-called Asian or Hong Kong flu in the late 1950s that doesn't seem to have made much of an impact, despite killing more than 100,000 Americans. So it really remains to be seen in terms of dramatic permanent changes. And I always think back and try to be careful and think back to all the proclamations that were made after September 11th, for example, about the viability of tall buildings, and that debate faded pretty quickly for all the reasons that others have mentioned. I think it will likely depend on how long this pandemic grinds on and whether it portends a lot more, which it may, or whether in fact we see a real desire for people to gather again. And what this means, my wife runs a performing arts organization. I'm working at home listening to her manage her own crisis. And this question of whether people will want immediately to gather once again as soon as they're allowed to, or whether there will be a kind of wariness, I think it's too soon to say.
One thing I could see, I agree with you that we need to wait a little while and see how people respond to public space. But the way that means that there needs to be more spaces so that people can be more spread out, and green spaces, I would say, for the city throughout the entire city, and not just in the wealthier parts, but also like the type of furniture that you would see in a park, where, could there be more of the type of thing that is flexible, where you can pull chairs apart, or settings for both individuals and not only group gatherings. I think those could start to, we've seen those things already in public spaces, but those seem to be very particularly useful in this situation.
Another question, Michael, unless Richard would like to interject, but we can move on.
Oh, let's go on.
So touching on the notion of reclaiming space, there's a question here from Leah, which is, can COVID be an opportunity to retrieve more public space from roads, say for pedestrians and bicycles, in order to respect physical distancing, allow people to go out?
Absolutely, I think that is a great issue to start tackling now. And again, the more that we can reduce those roadways, the more we can reduce the pollution that is caused by cars in inner cities, and increase overall health in cities.
The majority, the large majority in most cities of public space is parking. And one simple, it has complicated knock-on effects. If you couldn't park on the street, what would happen to the way in which you use transport? One thing is that you'd get a lot more, as we're seeing in Colombia now, in Bogota, people doing ride sharing, because it's very hard to park in a lot of Bogota and in Medellin. So again, this comes back to an issue not so much about the space as the space in itself, but how is it framed politically and economically? every parking space is a privatization of something which is public, you know? So that is something I think we could deal with without thinking about pedestrian versus automobile, but rather about how to return to the public what is the public's, which is that space. And that's why one of the recommendations that the UN has for sustainability is something that looks like a public version of Uber, where there are lots and lots of vehicles which are for use of people if more than 2 people are in the vehicle. And the vehicles that are not clogging streets. I mean, it's always true in urban planning that we think that there's a kind of visual or architectural magic bullet, and it doesn't work out like that. I mean, use is everything in planning, and use involves power and economics. And so this to me seems, it's an example of that. I think the other part of your question, of your listener's question, is what happens to places like sports gatherings? Pretty hard to imagine any stadium that I know of, or of your wife's theaters, any theater in which people are 6 feet apart, actually being viable. So what's the result of that? How is it something that can be redesigned, or are we going to have to think about those kinds of gatherings as completely reconfigured? Maybe they will all become things online. I can't imagine that. But that's a different question from the question about how we can actually reappropriate what is in public to the public. And that seems to me what's really involved in this public, the debate about restoring public space.
Exactly. I would say how can we use this crisis as a crowbar to basically sort of make changes?
Yes, absolutely.
Possible.
Yeah.
Okay, Michael, another question, please. I know we're running low on time.
Well, a question about previous interventions that have been made in the face of post-worldwide pandemics. And this is from Christine. Have there been any design interventions that we've implemented that have been historically implemented that were reactive and not actually necessary? Is there a way that we can prevent ourselves from doing that within this context?
And I'd like to add to that for the participants as well. There's been discussions about how technology plays into this, where there's a huge discussion about what kind of surveillance tools would be necessary for tracking people who are well or unwell, and sort of the privacy concerns and everything else that go along with that. So I don't know if anyone has thoughts there, but that's emerging as the sort of smart city component of this discussion in Singapore and elsewhere.
I was just going to mention that, I mean, it's not only, we think about these city plans spreading out in the face of pandemics, like the Radius by Le Corbusier, for example, but also like major natural resources have been altered. Like I was thinking of the Chicago River, which was reversed in its course to take used water away from city drinking water, which was in the lake, and sent polluted water sent downstream to the Gulf of Mexico, which 100 years ago, which was, there were at that time just such major interventions, a gigantic public works to address these kinds of crises. But I think now we have a chance to think about them. We know that there's negative repercussions from that. So it's, I think today we are thinking of systems that are more standalone and smaller scale and more local, that can help make places more resilient, like even being able to, within a certain smaller radius, deal with waste and growing food and all those things that are needed in a smaller space. And so it's not really addressing, Greg, the technology part of your question, but I will leave that for someone else to pick up. But again, that might implicate this kind of more finer grain solutions that we need to start thinking about.
And just quickly, I think we're right to be skeptical of the kind of smart city solutions or a technological quick fix. And I've been encouraged in conversations I've been having with architects and planners and on social media, kind of emerging discussion about the ways in which this pandemic has revealed a crisis in basic building blocks. So public health and the importance of public parks and the way green space, the way that Jeannie has talked about, and that there might be a return to focus on those basics before we start thinking about the so-called smart city. And the other issue in the Los Angeles context, in response to the question, is that we have a really remarkable history tied closely to our modernist architectural legacy of a relationship between domestic architecture in particular and public health. So we had a lot of our cultural emigres who wound up here in the early part of the 20th century were coming here because they had tuberculosis or dry air, and came on doctor's orders to the southwestern United States. And think about important modernist landmarks like the Lovell Health House, for example. There's a very good book recently on this by Lyra Kilston called Sun Seekers, The Cure of California. So there are ways in which earlier generations of responses to health crises have really shaped in very direct ways the architecture, particularly the residential architecture of LA.
Oh,
sorry, Richard, please.
Oh, I would just say about this is a very profound question. And it basically poses the issue, how much risk are you willing to take with other people for the sake of freedom? If you are not willing to take much risk, you can use all sorts of high tech like facial recognition, even genetic banding for people to make sure you're safe. If you hate that, then it's a question about how much are you willing to risk the health of yourself and other people. And of course, at that point, as we know, Greg, most smart city people say, well, it's not really my problem, but it is our problem. And I think it's one of the outcomes of this that we're going to think harder about the politics of smart cities than we've been doing before, where everybody was, oh, they're so wonderful, you know, it's the way of the future. You know, there is a relationship we've been thinking about this in UN a lot because we're trying to take censuses of urban populations, as in India. And every census is open to both abuse and to good uses. And I guess what I'm trying to say about this is all social life is indeterminate when it's free. And indeterminate means it could be dangerous. And it's a question of in the end, whether avoiding danger is important enough to give up that indeterminacy, which might include being liable to disease. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, it's a big question that now needs to be faced.
Well, this is the question again asked after 9/11, where in the moment after that, there was no limit to what people were willing to accept for the perception of public safety in the face of a terrorist threat. And again, snap decisions were made that were hard to walk back. It will be interesting to see what decisions we make or do not make in the face of this crisis. Michael, are we at time or do we have time for one more question?
I'm going to push the time over. I'm going to make this executive decision. I'm going to have one question specifically geared to Christopher and then one question for all the panelists, and then we'll wrap up. Christopher, there's a question here. Is LA measuring air quality, noise levels, and wildlife during this radically different urban time to enable later comparisons as the city recovers post-coronavirus?
Yes, we've been talking about it, and particularly if we move into some efforts to rebalance the street space, I think it would be a remarkable opportunity. We've seen a real improvement in air quality, of course, as the amount of driving has dropped dramatically. And I've just begun working with USC and Dornsife College there. And there are a number of scholars who have been doing that kind of air quality monitoring in other cities, particularly looking at the kind of super block model emerging in Spanish cities, and we're interested in whether we can do some of that the same kind of work in Los Angeles.
Thank you, Matt, very much. And I'm going to finish with this question from Delma. How can we quantify the co-benefits of public space, such as increased public trust and social cohesion, that have not really been financially quantified in times of disaster?
Well, I don't think you can quantify them. Which doesn't mean they're not there. They're visible, they're social, but putting a number to them is not the point of justifying them. It would be like in a church saying, are you 10% closer to God today, or 12% closer? But the thing about cooperation, as we're seeing now, is that even though it's not something you can put a number to, it's real. And if we don't have it, we're never going to be able to deal effectively with this crisis. Government is never alone going to allow us to overcome this. If you don't have cooperation, you don't have a healthy city.
I'd like to add on to that I think, today we're forced more and more to quantify everything. So if you want to get funds to do some social project in a city, just show how it will help and things like that. So in that sense, it's a good question that, we've been trying to address, and like how can you tell, if you're an architect, how can you tell if your projects are effective or not afterwards? So, one measure, I guess, have you seen is if people participate, how many things people participate in, like, for example, even voting, and that can be something that measures how committed people are to a, social, how much social cohesion there are, how much trust they have, and things like that. So I think there are some emerging ways to start to measure that. But when you're a designer, a lot of what you have to do is just try things out, but then go back and look at those things afterwards. I mean, we try to interview people after we design a public space and find out what they say about that place, now versus what it was before. And it is really important to try to understand if what we're doing is working or not. And so, as you point out, it is a crucial thing in a crisis like this, like even how much your neighbors. If you do live in that high-rise building, for example, how do you know if how do you create networks that people can collaborate on creating safety within that building, like how they use the elevator, or how, there could be systems that are come up with if you know each other in order to be safer. So I think as designers, we have to create places where people can connect and can start to build those levels of trust. And then we have to try to, I know it's not perfect as Richard says it, but try to go back and visit those places and find out if they're working through various means.
Thank you, Jeannie. I said that'll be a great addition. I keep thinking during this time, and going back to Rebecca Solnit's Paradise and Hell, and thinking about the utopian communities that emerged and organize networks like Occupy Sandy, and how they were very fledgling and of course dissipated afterwards. And how can we reinforce them? How can we, codify and concretize them literally through built form? Well, we're almost out of time. I want to thank attendees who have stayed for over time, and to thank two of our panelists, at least. I want to, if you want to continue the conversation, I want to quickly promote Studio Gang's Architecture, a sort of mid-career retrospective monograph that Jeannie has just published. And I'd also like to thank Richard. I think this is being published today, if I can get the screen to advance. Basically sort of Designing for Disorder, Experiments and Disruptions in the City with Pablo Sendra, a sort of practical, if I understand it correctly, a sort of practical guide extension of your last book, Building and Dwelling. So thinking about how do we actually make these interventions. So I would encourage viewers to go out and purchase those as well. Chris, we'll get your book next time when that book comes out. And yes, it's my pleasure that I invite you again all to come back a week from now at this time to join us for our session on public transport. And again, exactly the kind of discussions that Richard raised earlier about given the fact that public transportation in the United States and particularly in vast swaths of the world is facing dramatic falls off in ridership as we socially distance. How will these systems recover as the backbones of cities? And again, how can we use this crisis as an opportunity to rethink how we provision public transport, one of the ultimate public goods, as something that can help more people and not simply as a safety net service. So we will return then. And with that, I'd like to thank my panelists for joining us today from multiple time zones. And thank you all for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much, Greg.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank
you.
you.
Everybody.